Oliver Bennett stood in his glass-walled office on the 42nd floor, watching the city lights twinkle like scattered diamonds below. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes and rumpled shirt telling the story of another 18-hour workday. At 32, he had built Bennett Technologies from nothing into a billion-dollar empire. But success had come with a price he was still paying. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. Without looking, he knew it was his business partner, James, calling about tonight's arrangement. Oliver had agreed to fill in for James on a blind date, a favor he was already regretting. The plan was simple: bring his 4-year-old daughter Ruby along, make things awkward, and ensure the woman would never want to see him again. It was a cruel strategy, but Oliver had learned to protect his heart with walls of steel. Daddy R. You ready? Ruby's sweet voice broke through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant, Peanut, wearing a yellow sundress that made her look like a ray of sunshine. Her dark curls bounced as she skipped toward him, and despite his cynical mood, Oliver couldn't help but smile. Almost princess, he said, scooping her into his arms. Ruby giggled, her tiny hands patting his cheek with the gentle touch that always reminded him why he worked so hard. Since her mother had walked out when Ruby was just 6 months old, claiming she couldn't handle the responsibility, it had been just the two of them against the world. 20 minutes later, Oliver's driver pulled up to Café Luna, a small Italian restaurant downtown that James had chosen for its intimate atmosphere. Oliver adjusted Ruby's cardigan and took her hand, steeling himself for an evening of polite conversation and careful deflection. He had no intention of letting anyone close, enough to hurt Ruby the way her mother had. As they approached the restaurant entrance, Oliver noticed a commotion near the alley beside the building. A young woman with honey blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun was kneeling beside an elderly homeless man, offering him a takeout container and a bottle of water. Her clothes were simple, a faded denim jacket over a white t-shirt and worn jeans. But there was something luminous about her kindness that made Oliver pause. "Sir, please take this," she was saying gently. "It's still warm, and there's enough for 2 meals." The old man's eyes filled with tears. "God bless you, miss." "You don't know what this means?" Ruby tugged on Oliver's hand. "Daddy, why is that lady giving her food away?" Before Oliver could answer, the young woman turned at the sound of Ruby's voice. Her eyes were the color of warm caramel, and when she smiled at Ruby, something shifted in Oliver's chest. This wasn't part of the plan. "Hello there, beautiful," the woman said to Ruby, her voice soft and musical. "I love your dress. Yellow's my favorite color," Ruby beamed, suddenly shy, hiding partly behind Oliver's leg, while still peeking at the stranger. Oliver found himself studying the woman's face, noting the genuine warmth in her expression and the way she crouched down to Ruby's level without hesitation. "I'm Grace," the woman said, extending her hand to Ruby. "What's your name?" "Ruby." His daughter whispered, then added with growing confidence, "And this is Peanut." Grace solemnly shook the stuffed elephant's trunk. "It's very nice to meet you both, Peanut and Ruby." She stood and looked at Oliver expectantly. "Oliver," he said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm but gentle, her skin slightly paint-stained. He noticed. "Are you here for dinner?" Grace asked, glancing toward the restaurant entrance. Something in her tone made Oliver pause. There was a nervousness there, a hope mixed with uncertainty, that suggested she might be waiting for someone too. His heart sank as realization dawned. "You're not here for a blind date, are you?" he asked carefully. Grace's cheeks flushed pink. "James's friend? Is the one who was supposed to come instead of James?" They stared at each other for a moment, the irony of the situation settling between them. Here he was, planning to sabotage a date with a woman who had just given her dinner to a homeless man and charmed his daughter within minutes of meeting her. "Daddy," Ruby piped up, "can Miss Grace eat with us?" She gave away her food. Grace laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a summer breeze. "Oh, sweetie, I have money for dinner. I just couldn't walk past Mr. Henry without stopping. He's been sleeping out here for weeks." Oliver felt something crack inside his chest. In his world of corporate meetings and calculated moves, genuine kindness had become as rare as snow in summer. Yet here was this woman, who apparently knew a homeless man by name and had given up her meal without a second thought. Inside the restaurant, Oliver found himself in unfamiliar territory. Grace insisted on a booth instead of the intimate table for two James had reserved, saying it would be more comfortable for Ruby. She helped Ruby color on the kids' menu while Oliver struggled to maintain his emotional distance. "So what do you do?" Oliver asked, falling back on safe conversation. "I'm an artist," Grace said, not looking up from where she was helping Ruby draw a flower. "Well, trying to be. Right now, I teach art classes to kids during the day and work at a bookstore at night." "That must be exhausting." Grace shrugged. "It's worth it when you love what you do. Besides, I get to meet amazing little artists like Ruby here." She had drawn a perfect butterfly next to Ruby's flower, and Oliver's daughter was staring at it in wonder. "How did you do that?" Ruby asked, eyes wide. "Magic," Grace whispered conspiratorially, then winked. "Want me to teach you?" For the next hour, Oliver watched in amazement as Grace patiently showed Ruby different drawing techniques, praised every scribble as if it were a masterpiece, and told imaginative stories about the characters they created together. Ruby, usually shy around strangers, was completely captivated when their food arrived. Grace cut Ruby's chicken into perfect bite-sized pieces without being asked, wiped sauce from her chin with practiced ease, and somehow managed to make eating vegetables seem like a game. Oliver barely touched his own meal, transfixed by this woman who treated his daughter like she was precious. "You're good with kids," he said finally. "I love them," Grace replied simply. "They see the world with such wonder. Adults could learn a lot from children." "Like what?" Grace considered this, twirling pasta around her fork. "Like how to trust. Icily. How to find joy in simple things." She glanced at Ruby, who was carefully arranging her remaining peas in a smiley face. "Children don't judge people by their bank accounts or job titles. They care about kindness and whether you make them feel safe." Oliver felt heat rise in his cheeks. If only she knew about his bank account, his job title, his plan for tonight. But looking at Grace, seeing how she interacted with Ruby, he found himself hoping she would never find out. For the first time in years, someone was seeing him as just Oliver, not Oliver Bennett, the billionaire CEO. As the evening wound down, Grace insisted on paying her portion of the bill, despite Oliver's protests. "I asked for this date," she said. "Firmly, well, sort of. The least I can do is pay my own way." Outside the restaurant, Ruby had fallen asleep against Oliver's shoulder, clutching both Peanut and a small drawing Grace had made for her. Grace smiled at the sight, reaching out to gently stroke Ruby's curls. "She's wonderful," Grace whispered. "You're lucky to have each other." "Thank you," Oliver said, meaning more than just the compliment. "For tonight, I mean." Ruby hasn't smiled this much in months. Grace's expression grew thoughtful. "Being a single parent must be hard." Oliver nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He wanted to tell her everything, about the loneliness, about the fear of letting someone close, about how she had made him feel human again in just one evening. Instead, he said, "Would you like to do this again sometime? Maybe something more kid-friendly?" Grace's smile lit up her entire face. "Love that." As Oliver's driver pulled up, he realized his plan had backfired completely. Instead of driving Grace away, he found himself desperate to see her again. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind wondered what would happen when she discovered who he really was. Would she still look at him the same way? Would she still see Oliver the father? Or would she only see Bennett the billionaire? For now, though, he chose to hold on to this moment. The memory of Grace's laughter, the way Ruby had curled up trustingly in her lap, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, his carefully constructed walls were exactly what needed to come tumbling down. 3 weeks later, Oliver found himself living a double life he had never intended to create. In the mornings, he was still Oliver Bennett, CEO of Bennett Technologies, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. But in the evenings and on weekends, he became simply Oliver, Ruby's father, the man who Grace was slowly but surely falling for. Their second date had been at the Children's Museum, where Grace had been as enchanted as Ruby by the interactive exhibits. She had crawled through the miniature town, built elaborate towers in the construction zone, and helped Ruby conduct a pretend orchestra with more enthusiasm than any adult Oliver had ever known. When Ruby had spilled juice on Grace's white blouse, Grace had simply laughed and said it looked like abstract art. Their third meeting hadn't even been a date. Grace had texted Oliver on a Saturday afternoon, asking if he and Ruby wanted to come to the park where she was teaching a free art class for underprivileged children. Oliver had arrived to find Grace surrounded by a dozen kids, all of them painting with watercolors under the shade of an old oak tree. She was wearing paint-splattered overalls and had streaks of blue in her hair, looking more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen. "Mr. Oliver," Ruby had shouted, running to him with a painting of their family, 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "Miss Grace helped me make this." Grace had looked up from where she was helping a small boy with his sunset painting, her face lighting up when she saw them. "You came," she had said, as if she hadn't been sure he would, as if his presence was a gift instead of a given. Now, as Oliver sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports, his mind kept drifting to the memory of that afternoon. Grace had packed sandwiches for everyone, played tag with the children until she was breathless and laughing, and somehow convinced 3 different kids to try vegetables by making faces out of carrot sticks and celery. His assistant, Mrs. Peterson, knocked on the door. "Mr. Bennett, your 4 o'clock is here." Oliver looked up, confused. He didn't remember scheduling a 4 o'clock meeting. But before he could ask, James walked in, looking concerned. "We need to talk," James said, closing the door behind him. Oliver gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What's going on?" "It's about Grace Miller," James said, and Oliver felt his stomach drop. "I did some research after our conversation last week." Oliver's hands clenched into fists. "What kind of research?" "The kind that protects my business partner from potential gold diggers," James said bluntly. "Look, I know you think she's different, but Oliver, she's been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" James pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like social media screenshots. "She's been looking you up online, searching for Oliver Bennett. It's only a matter of time before she connects you to Bennett Technologies." Oliver's heart hammered against his ribs. Maybe she's just curious. People search for dates online all the time. "Maybe," James said, not sounding convinced. "Or maybe she's realized she hit the jackpot and she's trying to figure out how much you're worth." The words hit Oliver like physical blows. For 3 weeks, he had been living in a fantasy where someone could care about him for who he was, not what he had. The possibility that Grace might be playing a long game, pretending to be interested in him while calculating his net worth, made him feel sick. But even as doubt crept in, Oliver remembered the way Grace had given her dinner too. Homeless man, how she volunteered her time teaching art to children who couldn't afford lessons. How she had insisted on paying for her own meals, despite clearly being on a tight budget. None of those actions made sense if she was after his money. "I appreciate your concern," Oliver said carefully, "but I think you're wrong about her." James sighed. "I hope I am. But Oliver, think about Ruby. You can't risk her getting attached to someone who might disappear when they realize the money comes with conditions." That night, Oliver took Ruby to Grace's apartment for the first time. She lived in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, her loft space serving as both home and studio. The walls were covered with her paintings, bold splashes of color that seemed to capture emotions Oliver didn't have words for. And the air smelled like paint and turpentine, and something floral he couldn't identify. "It's not much," Grace said, suddenly self-conscious as she watched Oliver take in her space. "But the light is good, and the rent is cheap." Oliver studied a painting of a child's hands cupping a butterfly, the details so precise he could almost feel the delicate wings. "These are incredible, Grace. You're incredibly talented." Grace flushed with pleasure. "Thank you. Most people don't understand why I'd rather do this than get a real job." Ruby had discovered a corner where Grace kept art supplies specifically for children. "Miss Grace, can I paint something?" "Of course, sweetheart. What would you like to paint? A picture of you and Daddy and me?" Ruby said without hesitation. Grace's eyes met Oliver's across the room. something passing between them that made Oliver's chest tight with longing. He had spent his adult life building walls, protecting himself and Ruby from disappointment. But Grace was dismantling his defenses with every smile, every gentle touch. Day at preschool, Grace moved around the kitchen preparing dinner. She had apologized for not having much, but somehow she created a feast from simple ingredients. Homemade pasta with fresh herbs, salad from vegetables grown in pots on her fire escape, bread that filled the apartment with the most amazing aroma. I used to cook with my grandmother, Grace explained as she served them. She taught me that the most important ingredient is love. I know it sounds cheesy, but I really believe food tastes better when it's made with care. Oliver had eaten at the finest restaurants in the world, but nothing had ever tasted as good as Grace's simple meal shared around her. Paint-splattered table with Ruby chattering between them about everything and nothing. After dinner, while Ruby napped on Grace's couch surrounded by stuffed animals, Oliver helped Grace clean up. Working side by side in her tiny kitchen, passing dishes, and sharing comfortable silence, felt more intimate than anything Oliver had experienced in years. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said as she dried a plate. Oliver's pulse quickened. This was it. This was when she would ask about his job, his money, his real identity. "Sure, what happened to Ruby's mother?" The question caught Oliver off guard. "She left," he said simply. "Said being a mother wasn't what she expected." Grace was quiet for a long moment. That must have been devastating for Ruby. Yes, she deserves better. "For you too," Grace said gently, her hand covering his. "You deserved better too." Oliver looked down at their joined hands, Grace's fingers small and paint-stained against his. "I don't think about it much anymore." "Maybe you should, Grace." Said not to stay angry, but to remember that not everyone leaves. Some people stay even when things get hard. Something in her voice made Oliver look at her more closely. There was a sadness there, an understanding born from personal experience. "What about you?" he asked. "Ever been married? Kids?" Grace shook her head. "I was engaged once, to someone who wanted me to be different than I am. He thought my art was a hobby I'd grow out of, that I'd eventually want a normal life with a white picket fence and dinner parties." She smiled ruefully. "When I chose my dreams over his expectations, he left, said I was selfish for putting my passion before our relationship." Oliver felt a surge of anger toward this unknown man who had tried to dim Grace's light. "He was an idiot, maybe," Grace said, "but it taught me something important. I'd rather be alone and true to myself than with someone who wants to change me." As Oliver drove home that night with Ruby sleeping in the back seat, he couldn't stop thinking about Grace's words. She valued authenticity above everything else, which made his deception feel even worse. But how could he tell her the truth now? How could he explain that he was exactly the kind of person she seemed to distrust? Someone with enough money to buy anything, including people's affections. His phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Thank you for a wonderful evening. Ruby is an angel, and you're pretty great too." Oliver stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Thank you for dinner, and for everything else." But as he typed the words, James's warning echoed in his mind. What if her apparent sincerity was just a carefully crafted mask? The doubt felt like poison in his veins, but Oliver couldn't shake it completely. Too much was at stake, Ruby's heart most of all. And yet, when he remembered the way Grace had looked at him across her candlelit table, the way she had touched his hand with such tenderness, he found it impossible to believe it was all an act. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to tell her the truth. He would risk everything on the hope that Grace Miller was exactly who she seemed to be, a woman who valued love over money, authenticity over advantage. Tonight, he allowed himself to hold on to the fantasy a little longer, to believe that somewhere in this complicated world, someone could love him for exactly who he was, underneath it all. The truth came crashing down on a Tuesday morning in the most unexpected way. Grace was at the bookstore where she worked nights, reorganizing the business section during a rare, quiet moment when she saw it, staring back at her from the cover. A Forbes magazine was Oliver's face, but not the Oliver she knew. This Oliver wore an expensive suit and a confident smile. standing in front of a gleaming skyscraper with the headline, Tech Titan Oliver Bennett, How a College Dropout Built a $1 billion Empire. Grace's hands trembled as she opened the magazine, scanning the article with growing disbelief. Oliver Bennett, CEO and founder of Bennett Technologies, net worth $2.3 billion. Known for his privacy and his ruthless business tactics. Recent focus on expanding into international markets. The Oliver in these photos looked like a stranger. Gone was the gentle man who had spent an hour on the floor of her apartment teaching Ruby to draw perfect circles. Gone was the patient father, who had wiped paint from his daughter's cheeks without complaint. This Oliver looked cold, calculating, exactly the kind of man Grace had learned to avoid. Her phone buzzed with a text from Oliver, looking forward to tonight. Ruby's been talking about the zoo all week. Grace stared at the message, her heart breaking with each passing second. Tonight, they had planned to take Ruby to the zoo, then back to Grace's apartment for dinner. Ruby had been so excited, chattering about wanting to see the elephants, and asking if Miss Grace would help her draw them afterward. How could she face them now, knowing that everything had been built on a lie? Grace's co-worker, Jenny, noticed her distress. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost? Something like that, Grace whispered, closing the magazine with shaking hands. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Grace mechanically helped customers, restocked shelves, and counted register drawers, but her mind was spinning with questions and accusations. Had Oliver been laughing at her this whole time? Her tiny apartment, her second-hand clothes, her careful budgeting to afford even small luxuries like taking Ruby for ice cream? She remembered how he had let her pay for her own meals, how he had never once mentioned his job beyond saying he worked in tech. She had assumed he was maybe a programmer or a mid-level manager, someone like her, trying to make ends meet while chasing dreams. But $2.3 billion? That was beyond wealth. That was power. And power, in Grace's experience, always came with conditions. By the time Grace got home, she had made her decision. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't pretend that she belonged. In Oliver's world, couldn't risk Ruby getting more attached when the inevitable crash came. Because it always came. Rich men didn't end up with poor artists. Not in real life. Her phone was ringing when she walked through the door. Oliver's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment, Grace's resolve wavered. She could picture him. In her mind, probably getting Ruby ready for their zoo adventure, maybe making silly faces to make his daughter laugh. But then she remembered the magazine photos, the cold eyes of Bennett the billionaire, and she let the call go to voicemail. An hour later, there was a knock at her door. Grace knew it was Oliver before she opened it. He stood in the hallway holding Ruby's hand, both of them dressed for their zoo trip. Ruby wore a bright yellow t-shirt with a cartoon monkey on it, and she bounced excitedly when she saw Grace. Miss Grace, are you ready to see the elephants? Grace's heart cracked. She crouched down to Ruby's level, forcing a smile. Sorry, sweetheart, but I can't go to the zoo today. I'm not feeling well. Ruby's face fell. Are you sick? Daddy makes me chicken soup when I'm sick. Something like that, Grace said, her voice barely steady. She looked up at Oliver, saw the concern in his eyes, and felt her anger flare. He was still playing the part, still pretending to be someone he wasn't. Oliver studied her face, and she watched as understanding dawned. In his expression, Grace, can we talk? There's nothing to talk about, Grace said, starting to close the door. Oliver's hand shot out, stopping her. Please, give me 5 minutes, Daddy. What's wrong? Ruby asked, sensing the tension between the adults. Grace looked at Ruby's confused face and felt her heart break all over again. This beautiful little girl didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of her father's lies. Why don't you wait in the car with Thomas? Oliver said gently to Ruby. Miss Grace and I need to have a grown-up talk.
Ow.
But the elephants, Ruby protested. We'll see the elephants, Oliver promised. Just give me a few minutes, okay? After Ruby left, reluctantly holding Thomas's hand, Oliver turned back to Grace. You found out, did you think I wouldn't? Grace asked, her voice sharp with pain. Or was this some kind of game? Let's see how long we can fool the poor girl. It wasn't like that, Oliver said, stepping into her apartment uninvited. I never meant for it to go this far. Then what was it meant to be? Grace demanded, closing the door behind him, a little slumming. A chance to see how the other half lives. Oliver ran his hands through his hair, looking more distressed than she had ever seen him. James set up that blind date. I didn't want to go, so I brought Ruby to sabotage it. I thought if I showed up with a 4-year-old, whoever he had arranged would run for the hills. But I didn't run, Grace said quietly. No, you didn't. You were perfect with her. You were perfect, period. Oliver's voice broke slightly. And for the first time in years, someone was looking at me like I was just a man, not a bank account with legs. Grace laughed bitterly. So you decided to keep lying? I decided to keep being happy, Oliver said desperately. Do you know how rare that is for me? I haven't been happy since Ruby was born, and even then it was complicated because her mother left us. But with you, everything felt simple, natural. Nothing about this is simple, Grace said, gesturing around her tiny apartment. Look at this. Place Oliver. Look at my life. I patch holes in my jeans and count quarters for laundry money. You probably spend more on coffee in a day than I make in a week. I don't care about any of that, Oliver said, stepping closer. The money doesn't matter. The money always matters, Grace shot back. Maybe not to you, because you've never been without it, but it matters to everyone else. It changes people. It changes how they see you, how they treat you, what they expect. From you? Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you think happened? That the money changed how I see you? I think you never saw me at all, Grace said, tears finally spilling over. You saw some fantasy, some simple girl who didn't ask complicated questions or want complicated things. But I'm not simple, Oliver. I have dreams that don't include being someone's charity case. Charity case. Oliver looked stricken. Grace, you're the strongest person I know. You work 3 jobs to support yourself while chasing your dreams. You volunteer your time to help kids. You give your dinner to homeless people. You're incredible. I'm broke, Grace said flatly. I'm a broke artist who can't afford to live in the same world as you, and we both know it. Oliver reached for her hands, but Grace stepped back. What if that didn't matter? He asked desperately. What if we could find a way to make this work? How? Grace asked. By me pretending I don't notice when you pay for everything?
By you?
Pretending you don't mind that your girlfriend shops at thrift stores? By Ruby growing up thinking love means hiding who you really are? At the mention of his daughter, Oliver's face crumpled. Ruby adores you, and I adore her, Grace whispered. That's why I have to do this. Deserves better than watching her father's relationship fall apart when the fairy tale ends. What if it doesn't end? Oliver asked. What if this is real? Grace looked at him, this man she had fallen in love with, this stranger who had been lying to her for weeks, and felt her heart shatter completely. Real things are built on truth, she said quietly, and we never had that. Oliver stood there, for a long moment, his shoulders sagging with defeat. So that's it? You won't even try? I can't, Grace said, even though the words felt like they were tearing her throat. I won't be the poor girl who got lucky enough to catch a billionaire. I won't be your project or your rebellion against your world. And I won't let Ruby think that love means settling for secrets. Oliver nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. What do I tell her? Grace closed her eyes, picturing Ruby's sweet face, her excited chatter about elephants and art and all the adventures they would never have together. Tell her I had to go away for a while, Grace said. Tell her that sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices. Tell her that she's the most wonderful little girl in the world. And someday she'll understand why this had to happen. Oliver walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. For what it's worth, Grace, every moment with you was real for me. The man you fell for. That's who I am when I'm not being Oliver Bennett, the CEO. That's who I want to be. Maybe, Grace said softly. But that's not who you have to be. And I can't love someone who's only real part of the time. After he left, Grace sank to the floor of her apartment and cried until she had no tears left. Outside her window, the city glittered with lights that reminded her of promises that couldn't be kept, of dreams that were too big for reality to hold. In her heart, she knew she had done the right thing. Love wasn't enough when it was built on shifting sand. Ruby deserved a father who was honest about who he was. And Grace deserved a love that didn't require her to pretend she was someone else. But knowing something is right doesn't make it hurt any less. And as Grace looked around her apartment, everything reminded her of what she had lost. The corner where Ruby had painted her family portrait, the kitchen where Oliver had helped her wash dishes, the couch where they had all fallen asleep watching movies together. She had told Oliver that real things were built on truth. Now she had to find a way to build a real life from the pieces of her broken heart and somehow learn to be grateful for the brief, beautiful lie that had shown her what love could feel like, even if she could never have it for real.